Hey, I'm Sandy Gard. I'm inspired to share this material as boundaries are a common topic in the addictions recovery groups that I facilitate. I invite you to check out my services at ggirllifestyle.com. I should mention that all of the resources will be shared at the end of Module 5. This video will include a brief introduction and Module 1. Take a peek at the other videos on YouTube in days to come. Thank you. We all want to live an authentic life. We want to be ourselves and live our truth. On the surface, this seems like an easily achievable goal. Societal pressures and the expectations of those around us influence our motivations and values until we're uncertain of where we stop and others begin. When we act in accordance with what other people want rather than with who we really are, we aren't living an authentic life. Authenticity is defined as a consistency between who you are on the inside and how you behave. It's also conceptualized as a commitment to yourself and your values. So, if the goal is for our authentic self to thrive, we need to get clear on who we truly are, what we want, and how to defend our true self from outside influences. This is where boundaries come in. Boundaries help us identify our limits and see the difference between what's ours and what's not ours. They help us show up more authentically because we're certain about who we are. This clarity allows us to commit to our values, behave in ways that are consistent with how we define ourselves, and protect ourselves. Personal boundaries can be understood as the limits and expectations we set with ourselves and others that make us feel safe and whole. Setting boundaries can look different depending on the boundary and the context. Let's go through a few common examples of what it means to set a boundary. We'll discuss all of these in more depth further into this course. Clearly articulating expectations helps define the role of each person in a relationship. It helps both parties meet each other's needs. An expectation can be something as simple as expecting your friend to return your shirt in the same condition it was in when they borrowed it. Personal boundaries are an essential part of living an authentic life. We require boundaries to know who we are, to make decisions that will help us thrive and keep us safe, and meet our needs. When examined closely, we might find that boundaries could improve our lives in nearly every way. Let's briefly discuss a few more reasons that setting boundaries is important before moving on to the rest of this course. Boundaries help us honor who we are. Setting boundaries is an acknowledgement that our needs are valid and we're worthy of having them met. When we move through the world without boundaries, we may disregard our needs so that we can meet the needs of others. Also, we may dismiss our needs as unimportant or identify as someone who isn't worth all the trouble. When we set boundaries, we're honoring the fact that each of us are precious and worthy of care and safety. Boundaries help protect us from outside influence and manipulation. In other words, when we set strong boundaries, we're less likely to be coerced into behaving in ways that conflict with our authentic self. They also help protect us by ensuring that our needs are met and that we're not overextending ourselves in a way that only serves others. When we overextend ourselves or allow someone to repeatedly violate a boundary, we'll start to feel burned out and bitter. By setting and upholding boundaries, we protect ourselves from these undesirable states of mind. One of the main reasons we're reluctant to set boundaries is fear of damaging our relationships. However, when we're in a healthy relationship, setting boundaries improves the relationship. Being clear and direct about our needs provides a greater sense of trust and connection. Additionally, the person we're in a relationship with can feel more comfortable knowing that they aren't going to accidentally trample a boundary they didn't know we had. Boundaries are a critical piece of self-care. Setting boundaries honors the fact that we're human beings with needs that are worthy of being met. When we choose to fully recognize our humanity in this way and fully engage with our authentic self, we're better able to care for and nourish ourselves. In the upcoming modules, we'll touch on many more of the ways in which boundaries can improve our lives. We'll also learn more about what boundaries are, where they come from, how to identify where we need boundaries, and how to set and keep our boundaries. So we're moving into the first module now. That's our part 1 video. Module 1, exploring the boundaries of our lives. Our lives are defined by the boundaries we set. In this module, we'll talk more about what boundaries are, why they're important, and the different types of boundaries we might need to set. First up, boundaries and personal identity. The boundaries we set are an important part of our identity. Our identity is comprised of who we think we are. The way we define ourselves usually includes our values, goals, beliefs, and behaviors. Our boundaries are a reflection of our values, goals, and beliefs, and govern our behaviors. When we lack boundaries, we allow others into a space where they're not welcome, where they can start to substitute pieces of ourself with whatever serves them best. This isn't to suggest that everyone you lack boundaries with are out to harm you. Often, the people that take advantage of our boundarylessness don't realize they're doing it. However, whether nefarious or not, the end result is that we behave in ways that are discordant with what we truly want and who we truly are. How boundaries protect us. Boundaries help us ensure that our needs are met, that we're safe in our relationships, and that we aren't extending ourselves beyond our capacity. When we lack boundaries, or lack healthy boundaries at least, we don't have the protections that allow us to live our best, fullest lives. What exactly our boundaries are and where we are lacking them isn't always apparent. There are several warning signs we can look out for that may indicate a space in which we could create healthier boundaries. Let's take a look at a few of them. Neglecting self-care. One of the boundaries most of us struggle with is boundaries around how we spend our time and who we spend it on. If we struggle to say no or prioritize others over ourselves, we lose the time we need to spend on self-care. If you're too busy serving others to tend to your own needs, it's important to re-examine your boundaries. Difficult, dramatic, or draining relationships. When we lack boundaries, we open ourselves up to being controlled and manipulated, and we may sometimes attract the kind of people who will seek to take advantage of us. Relationships with people like this are typically tumultuous and exhausting. If you have friends or partners that consistently make you feel depleted, this may be a sign that you need better boundaries with that person. Hypersensitive to the opinions of others. It isn't wrong to care about how others perceive you, but when you let the opinions of other people define you or dictate your self-esteem, it's probably time to check out your boundaries. Loss of self. As mentioned previously, boundaries help inform our identities. When we lack healthy boundaries, we can end up behaving in ways that conflict with who we really are. If you find that you're having trouble recognizing yourself or making sense of your actions, it's likely time to consider where you might be lacking some boundaries. Resentment. Resentment comes from the inability to react to an injustice. If you are feeling resentful towards someone, it may be a sign that there's something unjust about your relationship with them, resulting from a lack of boundaries. Bitterness. One of the quickest ways to identify where you're lacking boundaries is to consider when and toward whom you feel bitter. Bitterness arises when we're consistently denying our own needs in the service of others. Burnout. Burnout is a common consequence of overextending ourselves. If we're feeling burned out, it may be a sign that we need healthier boundaries about how we spend our time. Here's an exercise called I Saw the Sign. Reflect on the list of signs we just covered and note which ones you recognize in your own life. This isn't an exhaustive list. So if you notice any signs that we didn't discuss, feel free to add them. Pick one or two of the signs you see in your life and design a warning sign that represents each. For example, if you recognize symptoms of burnout in your life, you might create a sign like the one below. So we see the battery is running really low in energy there. That person needs to recharge, maybe emotionally, physically, spiritually, mentally, or all of them. Types of boundaries. Boundaries can be categorized in many ways according to the life domain in which they exist and the aspect of yourself that they protect. In this module, we're focusing on the following 5 types of boundaries: physical, intellectual, emotional, material, and temporal. Physical boundaries include personal space, physical touch, and privacy. In regards to personal space, this refers to the perimeter around your body at which you're uncomfortable with the presence of another person. Your personal space preference will likely be different for different people and different contexts. Physical touch. Boundaries surrounding physical touch include any action in which one person's body comes in contact with another's. This might be things like hugging, kissing, or holding hands, as well as less intimate actions like shaking hands or a pat on the back. Privacy. Privacy boundaries include everything you deem personal and prefer to keep to yourself. For example, if your partner reads your text messages without permission, they have violated a privacy boundary. Intellectual. Intellectual boundaries refer to your freedom to hold and express your own thought, ideas, and opinions without being dismissed or belittled. Essentially, intellectual boundaries protect your individuality and guard against being influenced by people who have not earned your trust. For example, if someone calls you hurtful names or yells at you about the opinions you express during a conversation in an attempt to get you to agree with them, they are violating your intellectual boundaries. Emotional. Emotional boundaries are all about interpersonal expressions of feelings. They refer to the expectation that when you share your feelings, they will be respected. That is, when you express your feelings, you expect that you will not be belittled and that your feelings will not be invalidated. Emotional boundaries also safeguard you against unwillingly sharing the burden of someone else's feelings or performing emotional labor you didn't consent to. For example, when a friend calls you to vent about their ex or their terrible boss without asking first, they violated an emotional boundary. Other examples of emotional boundary violations include gossiping about another person, sharing a friend's secret, minimizing feelings, telling people how they should feel, and oversharing or sharing inappropriate information. Material. Material boundaries refer to expectations surrounding how others treat your material possessions. For example, when you loan something to a friend, you expect it to be returned in a reasonable amount of time, in the same condition in which it was lent. If someone takes something without your permission, or damages something that belongs to you and refuses to fix it, they have violated your material boundaries. Temporal. Temporal boundaries refer to how you spend your time. Unhealthy time boundaries lead to struggles with the work-life balance, neglecting self-care, and prioritizing others' needs over your own. These are the kind of boundaries that most of us struggle with. We have the tendency to agree to do things we don't want to do, take on extra work we know we don't have time for, and prioritize our partners, children, and friends, which results in little time for ourselves. Time boundaries can also include making requests at a bad time, such as late at night when someone might be sleeping, and expecting someone to be available and responsive at all times. In the digital age, when we're all theoretically accessible at nearly every hour of the day, the expectation to immediately text or call back is common. Having healthy time boundaries can help us prioritize the activities that are important to us and proceed with them uninterrupted. Exercise. What do your boundaries look like? For each boundary category, write out an example of a boundary you have or would like to have. For instance, if you're an artist, a temporal boundary might be that you will not do commissions for free. Try to think of at least one boundary for every category, but the more you can think of, the better. So just a reminder that all of the categories are physical, intellectual, emotional, material, and temporal. Boundaries in different life domains. Different life domains each entail their own set of challenges and requirements when it comes to boundaries. The different types of boundaries we just described may manifest differently in each life domain. Let's talk a bit about setting boundaries in each of the 4 life domains. Those are showing up as family, friends, work, and intimate relationships. Starting with family. Family boundaries help define the roles, rules, and responsibilities of each family member and serve to create a safe space where we know what to expect and what is expected of us. Adults in a family need boundaries with each other and with their children, but it's also important to allow children to set their own boundaries. When a child's boundaries are respected, it shows them that their needs are valuable, and it saves them from having to learn that as an adult. Family may be one of the most difficult life domains in which to set and maintain boundaries for several reasons. Let's talk through a few of them. Changes the rules. If you grew up without boundaries, your family is accustomed to expecting that you'll agree to all of their requests, brush off the snide jokes they make about you, and ignore their invasions of your privacy. When we set boundaries as an adult, we're suddenly and drastically changing the rules of the game in the eyes of your family. Your parent may feel insulted when you turn down their invitation to dinner because that never happens. You always say yes. Physical proximity. The physical space that exists between you and your family can be a deterrent to setting boundaries. If we live with or close to our family, we're less able to distance ourselves if a family member reacts negatively to our boundaries or refuses to honor them. But we have a long history. Our reasons for not wanting to disappoint our family have developed over the course of our whole lives, and therefore can be quite complicated. For example, we may desperately want the approval of our parents, which can make the prospect of upsetting them horrifying. They know us too well. Family members are often aware of our weaknesses. Knowing what we are sensitive about or reactive to makes it easier to manipulate us into dismissing our own needs and neglecting our boundaries. We aren't the only ones affected by a feud. Because families are a system, discord between 2 parts of that system can disrupt the whole thing. In other words, if a feud erupts over the boundaries we've set, the animosity can affect other members of the family. Knowing that we aren't the only ones that may have to deal with the consequences of our boundaries can feel like a huge barrier. Though there are many additional challenges that we need to overcome when setting boundaries with our families, it's worth the effort to do so. As Dr. Susan Newman suggests, if you truly are to be your own person, you have to practice self-protection, and that means sometimes you have to say no to those you love. Friendships, like families, are also a tricky space for setting boundaries. Our friends are special to us, and we don't want to lose them. So the idea of saying no and setting boundaries can feel like a big risk. However, if you have a friend that would rather end the relationship than respect your boundary, this is likely not the kind of relationship that will enrich your life in a meaningful way. Though many of the boundaries we may wish to set in our friendships will be the same as or similar to those we set in other life domains, there are some boundary issues that are more specific to friendships. Let's take a look at a couple of common boundary issues that arise in friendships. Acting as an advisor. Our treasured ability to be open and honest with our friends can sometimes set us up for frustration and burnout. That is, there's commonly an expectation that part of our responsibility in a friendship is constantly being open to listening to our friends' more intimate thoughts, feelings, and issues. This, however, is not a realistic expectation, and trying to consistently fulfill this perceived responsibility can lead us to feel frustrated and compel us to engage less with our friends. Loaning money and possessions. We may be quick to loan our friends money or let them borrow something they need because we love them. However, we don't always consider whether or not we want to be a lending source before we offer our resources. Loaning money or other possessions to our friends when we don't really want to can make us feel resentful, and ultimately it can be damaging to the friendship. Unsolicited advice and feedback. Both offering and receiving unsolicited advice and feedback can strain an otherwise healthy friendship. Typically, the motivation for offering unsolicited advice is good. Most of the time, a friend is just trying to help. However, this can make us feel unheard, or like our friend thinks they know better than we do, which can create fertile ground for conflict. The needy friend. Having needs, no matter how many, is never wrong. Expecting that our friends will always be available to meet them, however, demonstrates the lack of healthy boundaries around time and emotional availability. Work. Setting boundaries at work is different from setting boundaries with family, friends, and intimate partners, in part because our roles are more clearly defined. Many of us have a hard time setting boundaries at work because we fear that saying no will make us look like we aren't a team player, or that we will earn the boss's disapproval. Good work boundaries can help us perform better and puts us in a position to do more of the work we want to do and that would be of a benefit to us and less of the work that drains the life out of us. Intimate relationships. Intimacy refers to a particular kind of closeness characterized by familiarity, privileged knowledge, strong positive emotional attachments, and trust. Theorists describe an intimate relationship in terms of a private, exclusive exchange that generates a foundation of trust. In other words, a relationship is only intimate so long as there's something that the people in the relationship only give to each other. Thus, boundaries are important for delineating what the special something is and how it is to be shared. This exercise is called Where Are Your Boundaries? Look back at the list of boundaries you made earlier and consider the domain in which each might fall. If one boundary applies to multiple domains, think of how it might manifest differently in each. Next to each boundary on your list, write out the domain it fits in. This will help you start to see patterns in what boundaries you need and where you need them. How healthy are your boundaries? Boundaries are not a binary phenomenon. That is, it isn't the case that you either have boundaries or you don't. There are different degrees to which we enforce our boundaries. For example, we may have boundaries around how we use our time, but those boundaries might be too flexible to actually protect us. Similarly, we may hold boundaries that are so rigid that we shut out the opportunity for the kind of closeness and intimacy healthy boundaries can offer us. Let's take a look at some of the characteristics of healthy and unhealthy boundaries. Healthy boundaries. These depend on an awareness of your emotional, mental, and physical capacities, in addition to the ability to clearly communicate your needs. Here are some of the characteristics of those healthy boundaries. 1. Your boundaries are flexible depending on the context. 2. You're clear about your values. 3. You can listen to your own opinion. 4. You can be vulnerable with those whom you trust. 5. You're comfortable saying no. 6. You're comfortable being told no. Unhealthy boundaries. Boundaries that are unhealthy are typically either too porous or too rigid. Characteristics of porous boundaries include 1. They may be weak boundaries. 2. They may be poorly expressed. 3. They may create damaging relationship dynamics. 4. They may set us up for codependency. 5. They may have us accepting mistreatment. And 6. We may be having fear of being rejected. Rigid boundaries. Characteristics of rigid boundaries include healthy exceptions to the rules are never allowed. There may be a fear of vulnerability. We may be building walls. We may never share. We may have unrealistic expectations of others, or we may be cutting people out. Now, if there's an abusive relationship, there would be that would be a healthy boundary if you're cutting people out if you're experiencing abuse. So keep this in mind as we go through. In summary, boundaries are an important part of who we are. They help define us and protect us from the unwanted influence of others. There are many different types of boundaries and many different life domains in which we might need to set them. When we're setting or reevaluating our boundaries, it's important to determine if they're healthy or unhealthy. So that's the end of our part 1. Keep watch for part 2, which should be posted in a few days. Just want to remind you, if you're interested in the resources related to this material, the resources will be shared at the end of Module 5. Thanks for watching, and if you feel so inclined, please like, share, and subscribe.